It was 2:14 a.m. on a red-eye flight drifting over the dark Atlantic, while the cabin remained dim, silent, and heavy with the breathing of sleeping souls. In seat 8A, a middle-aged man named Mark Reynolds sat slumped in a worn-out jacket, the shadows under his eyes marking a life of exhaustion. Suddenly, a violent jolt snapped the cabin into chaos, as call buttons chimed and the seatbelt sign flashed red. A strange metallic grinding echoed from the floorboards while panic spread like a fever. Then the intercom crackled with the captain's trembling voice. "Is there any combat pilot on board?" The man in seat 8A slowly opened his eyes. Mark Reynolds did not look like the kind of man who belonged in a cockpit. At 44, he looked like a man the world had simply exhausted. He was thin, his hair was graying at the temples, and his hands were stained with the ink of office work. His posture was perpetually slightly hunched, as if he were carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders that the rest of the world couldn't see. But under that cheap cotton jacket, beneath the layers of middle management stress and grocery lists, was the soul of a warrior. 10 years ago, Mark was known as Spectre. He was a decorated combat pilot, a master of the skies who could dance a multi-million-dollar fighter jet through a lethal storm of surface-to-air missiles without breaking a sweat. He had been the lead tactician of the 77th Squadron, a man whose instincts were so sharp they felt like prophecy. But he had left that life behind, buried under a decade of silence and regret. He left after a final mission over a jagged, nameless mountain range. A mission where the sky had turned into an altar of fire. It was a day when the radio went static, and the last thing he heard was the desperate, choked breath of his wingman, a boy no older than 24, before his jet disintegrated into the clouds. That silence was a ghost that still woke Mark up, screaming in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, searching for a radio dial that wasn't there. After his wife passed away 3 years ago from a sudden illness, the sky became his ultimate enemy. He hated the heights. He hated the artificial pressure of the cabin. He traded the roar of Pratt & Whitney engines for the quiet, repetitive rhythm of being a single father to his 10-year-old daughter, Emma. Mark was only boarding this flight because of a sacred promise. Emma had earned her first lead role in the school play, and he had promised her, with his pinky finger locked in hers, that he wouldn't miss it. He chose seat 8A for a very specific, tactical reason. It was close to the aisle and the emergency exit. He needed to know exactly where the door was at all times. He needed to know he could get out if the walls started closing in, a lingering gift of claustrophobia from the day his cockpit canopy had jammed during a 9G maneuver, leaving him trapped in a glass coffin for 2 hours on a scorching runway. Before the turbulence hit, he had fallen asleep from pure, bone-deep exhaustion, his head resting against the cold plastic window, dreaming of nothing but the sound of Emma's laughter. Deep inside the belly of the Boeing 797, miles beneath the feet of the sleeping passengers, something was going catastrophically wrong. It started as a tiny, microscopic shiver in the primary hydraulic lines, a resonance frequency that shouldn't have existed. Then the primary flight computer, the brain of the aircraft, caught a logic glitch, a digital seizure. It began fighting the elevators, trying to correct a stall that was entirely imaginary. In the cockpit, Captain Miller was battling a phantom. The control yoke was vibrating with enough force to bruise his palms and rattle his teeth. He was following every civilian protocol in the manual, cycling the breakers and checking the crossfeeds. But the manual was designed for predictable mechanical failures. This was something else. This was a machine that had lost its mind. Miller looked at his co-pilot, a young man named Harris, whose face had turned the color of damp ash. They were losing altitude at a terrifying rate, the altimeter spinning downward like a countdown clock. The primary flight displays were flickering in a sickening, rhythmic pulse that signaled a total system collapse. The captain realized in a moment of clarity that he didn't need a commercial pilot who followed rules right now. He needed a pilot who knew how to ignore the rules to save the machine. He needed someone who understood the language of the metal, someone who had lived through the chaos of a cockpit failure in the heat of a dogfight. With a heavy heart and a hand that shook despite his best efforts, Miller keyed the intercom. He knew this would shatter the peace of the cabin, but it was his only remaining move before the aircraft became unrecoverable. Is there any combat pilot on board? The question hung in the air like a death sentence, vibrating through the speakers and into the souls of every passenger. Mark's eyes didn't just open. They sharpened into a predatory focus. Before his conscious brain even processed the fear of the passengers around him, his body reacted with 10 years of repressed muscle memory. His heart rate spiked, not from the fear of death, but from an old, familiar rush of combat adrenaline. He didn't hear the screaming or the crying. He heard the vibration of the fuselage and recognized it immediately. That wasn't wind shear. That was a high-frequency hydraulic surge caused by a feedback loop in the actuators. He looked at the ceiling, his mind automatically calculating the pitch rate and the asymmetric lift. The warrior was no longer sleeping. The Spectre had returned. Mark unbuckled his seatbelt with a deliberate, slow click that felt incredibly loud in the sudden silence of his row. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy like lead, his head still foggy from the remnants of a deep sleep. As he stepped into the aisle, he felt the physical weight of 300 pairs of eyes filled with terror, desperation, and judgment. He looked disheveled. His hair was messy, his shirt was wrinkled at the collar, and he looked like a man who struggled to pay his electric bill, not a man who could save a 300-ton aircraft. The businessman in Seat 9B, a man named Henderson who wore a sharp Italian suit and a watch that cost more than Mark's car, looked up and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that was fueled by pure panic. "Him?" Henderson whispered loudly to his wife, his voice dripping with elitist venom. "You've got to be kidding me. That guy looks like he can barely drive a sedan, let alone a wide-body jet. He's probably just looking for a better seat." A few people nearby murmured in agreement, their fear manifesting as a desperate need to find someone more qualified-looking to save them. A flight attendant named Sarah hurried toward him, her face a pale mask of professional terror. She stopped in front of Mark, her eyes darting from his worn-out sneakers to his tired, lined face. "Sir, did you hear the announcement?" Mark nodded, his voice raspy and low, yet it carried an unmistakable weight of authority that made Sarah take a half step back. "I'm a pilot, ex-military, 77th Squadron. Call sign Spectre. I have 8,000 hours in heavy-thrust airframes." The attendant hesitated, her hand hovering over her radio. She was looking for a badge, a uniform, a crisp white shirt with gold bars, some symbol of the authority she had been trained to respect. All she saw was a tired single dad in a frayed jacket. Another passenger, a younger man in a college hoodie, shouted from the back, "Don't let him in! He's probably some nutjob who played too much flight simulator. We need a real pilot, not a hobo." The skepticism in the cabin began to boil over. People were shouting now, their terror turning into a toxic blend of anger, classism, and panic. A woman in the front row gripped her husband's arm so hard her knuckles turned white, tears streaming down her face as she begged the crew not to let a stranger into the cockpit. "It's a security risk. He doesn't have a badge," she shrieked. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of sweat and recycled air, and the plane gave another gut-wrenching lurch that sent a service cart crashing into a bulkhead. Mark stood his ground, his feet planted wide to absorb the vibration. He didn't argue with the shouting passengers. He didn't try to defend his appearance. He knew from years of combat briefing that in a crisis, ego is the first thing that gets you killed. He leaned into Sarah, his voice dropping to a low, clinical tone that ignored the noise of the cabin. "Listen to me carefully," Mark said, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "The vibration you're feeling is 400 hertz. Your left wing root is under asymmetric stress because the spoilers are fighting the ailerons. If you don't get me through that door in the next 60 seconds, the flight computer is going to trim the nose into a terminal dive that no human pilot can pull out of. Tell the captain Spectre is here with a flash override code, Alpha Niner 7 Echo." Sarah froze. The way he said those words, the specific technical jargon, the absolute cold certainty in his voice, changed the atmosphere around him. It was as if he had suddenly grown 6 inches taller. She grabbed her handset, her hands shaking, and relayed the message to the flight deck. There was a long, agonizing silence over the line, and then the cockpit door unlatched with a heavy mechanical thud that echoed like a gunshot through the galley. "Sir, please follow me," Sarah said, her voice now filled with a desperate, breathless kind of respect. As Mark walked past Seat 9B, Henderson sneered one last time. "If you kill us, I'll sue your estate into the ground." Mark didn't even blink. He didn't see the businessman. He didn't see the angry faces. He was already mentally visualizing the cockpit layout of a 737. He was focused on a little girl in seat 12C who was clutching a stuffed rabbit so tightly its head was crooked. He thought of Emma. He thought of the promise he had made. He thought of the pinky swear. He stepped through the heavy armored door. The freeze moment hit him like a physical blow. The smell of ozone from short-circuiting wires. The blinding flash of red warning lights against the dark windows. The screaming, discordant chorus of 3 different alarms. The door locked behind him with a finality that felt like the closing of a tomb, sealing him back into the world of high-stakes aviation he had spent 10 agonizing years trying to forget. He wasn't a dad anymore. He was the Spectre. The cockpit was a high-tech nightmare. Captain Miller was drenched in sweat, his shirt soaked through, pulling back on the yoke with such force that the tendons in his neck were standing out. "He's here! Get him in the jump seat!" Harris, the co-pilot, yelled over the roar of the wind. Mark didn't sit down. He stood behind them, his eyes scanning the hundreds of gauges and digital displays with a speed that surpassed human sight. He wasn't looking at the big red warning signs. He was looking at the raw sensor data in the sub-menus, the numbers the computer was trying to hide. "Captain, stop pulling. Now," Mark commanded. His voice was like a shard of ice cutting through the noise. "I can't. If I let go, the nose drops. We're at 24,000 feet and falling," Miller shouted, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "No," Mark said, leaning over and placing a firm hand on Miller's shoulder. "The computer thinks the nose is dropping because the pitot tubes are giving a ghost reading from a frozen sensor. You're fighting a phantom, Captain. Every time you pull back, you're overstressing the rear stabilizer. You're going to snap the tail off this aircraft." Mark reached over the center console, his fingers moving with a grace and speed that seemed impossible. He didn't break any civilian protocols, but he manipulated the system's backdoor maintenance codes, tricks he had learned when he had to fly damaged jets back to aircraft carriers in the middle of the night. He adjusted the sequence of the hydraulic resets, forcing the digital bus to ignore the corrupted data. "Trust me," Mark said, his eyes meeting Miller's in the reflection of the glass display. "Level the wings. Trust the mechanical backup, not the digital bus. If I'm wrong, we're dead anyway. If I'm right, we live." Miller looked into Mark's eyes for one long, agonizing second. He saw 10,000 hours of survival in those pupils. He saw a man who had stared at death and told it to wait. Miller let go of the yoke. The plane groaned. The metal of the fuselage screamed as the aerodynamics shifted. And then, the vibration stopped. The nose leveled out. The alarms fell silent, leaving only the steady hum of the engines. A window of time had opened. They were no longer falling. The immediate danger of a mid-air breakup was over, but they were far from safe. The left engine was running at 40% efficiency due to the hydraulic surge, and the weather at Gander, the nearest emergency strip, was a wall of nightmare. The tower was reporting crosswinds of 55 knots, gusting to 80, with freezing rain and zero visibility. Harris, the co-pilot, was in a state of total psychological shock. His hands were trembling so much he couldn't even hold the approach plate. Mark looked at the cockpit door. He could go back to seat 8A. He had saved the plane. He had done more than anyone could ever ask. He could go back to being the invisible, tired dad. But then, a memory hit him like a lightning strike. He remembered his final mission 10 years ago. He had been the lead. He had chosen to follow the safe orders, staying at high altitude while his wingman went down into the clouds to help a ground unit. He had lived with that safe choice for a decade, and it had eaten him alive. "I'm staying," Mark said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He didn't wait for permission. He slid into the co-pilot's seat as Harris stood up, looking grateful to be relieved of the burden. "You're not authorized for this, Mark," Miller said, even as he began the descent checklist. "Sue me later," Mark replied, his hands already dancing over the throttle quadrant. He didn't do it for a medal. He didn't do it to prove Henderson in 9B wrong. He did it because Emma was waiting in the third row of a middle school auditorium. He did it because he realized that being a father isn't about avoiding the storm. It's about having the courage to fly through it to get home to the person who needs you. "Captain, let's bring this bird home," Mark said. He took the secondary controls. He felt the vibration of the aircraft through his fingertips, a language he had forgotten he knew. For the first time in 10 years, he wasn't afraid of the sky. He was the master of it once more. He began calling out the power pulses, compensating for the asymmetric lift with a precision that was purely instinctual. The approach was a violent, bucking bronco of a flight. The plane danced in the crosswinds, crabbed at a 30-degree angle against the runway. Mark's voice was steady, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby as he guided Miller through the final seconds. "Power, now, left rudder, hold it. Flaps to 30, easy, we've got this. Touchdown." The tires hit the wet asphalt with a deafening, soul-shaking screech. The plane tilted dangerously to the left, but Mark was already on the brakes and the thrust reversers, fighting the wind for every inch of the runway. There was no cheering in the cockpit, no shouting, just the sound of 300 people holding their breath in a silence so deep it felt holy. The plane slowed. It turned off the active runway. It stopped. And then a collective soul-deep exhale filled the entire aircraft. As the plane came to a complete halt at the emergency gate in Gander, the adrenaline that had sustained Mark for the last hour began to evaporate, leaving him with a heavy, bone-deep fatigue that made his vision blur. The passengers began to stand, their voices a chaotic, high-pitched mix of hysterical crying and relief. Mark quietly unbuckled his 5-point harness and stood up, his legs shaking. Captain Miller stood up as well, his eyes wet with tears. He grabbed Mark's hand in a grip that was almost painful. "I don't even know your name," Miller whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But I know I've never seen anyone fly like that. You didn't just save a plane, Spectre. You saved 300 families." "It doesn't matter," Mark said, offering a tired ghost of a smile. He felt a strange detachment from the hero he had just been. "Just do me a favor. Tell the maintenance crew to check the bus tie breakers and the actuator seals. And don't mention my name in the report if you can help it. I have a very busy schedule of being a nobody." As the cockpit door opened, a wave of noise hit him. The flight attendants were trying to manage the deplaning process, but the passengers were lingering, peering toward the flight deck. Mark tried to slide through the gap, keeping his head down, but the air was thick with the intensity of people who had just stared into the abyss and survived. He felt a few hands reach out to touch his sleeve, tentative, reverent gestures that made him feel profoundly uncomfortable. He wasn't a savior. He was just a father who had been pushed into a corner by fate and decided to fight back. Mark walked back into the cabin. He wanted to reach the seat A to A before the crowds got too thick and the media arrived. He just wanted his jacket. As he walked down the aisle, the man in seat 9B, Henderson, stood up. The businessman's face was red with shame, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained with spilled coffee. He looked at Mark's grease-stained hands and his tired, ordinary face. "Sir," Henderson muttered, his voice cracking, I was an arrogant idiot. I'm sorry, I was terrified. And I took it out on you because you didn't look like what I thought a hero should look like. Thank you for saving my wife. Thank you for saving us all." Mark placed a steady hand on the man's shoulder. He didn't lecture him. He didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just looked at him with the tired eyes of a man who had seen too much. "Fear does strange things to people, Mr. Henderson," Mark said softly. "It makes us forget that we're all in the same boat. Just go home and hug your family. That's the only thank you I need." He paused, looking Henderson directly in the eye. "Real strength isn't about the watch you wear or the seat you sit in. It's about what you have left when all of that is taken away. Today we all had nothing but each other. Remember that." A few rows back, a mother clutching a toddler stood up and tried to press a small religious medal into his hand. Mark gently shook his head, closing her fingers over the token. "Keep it," he whispered. "Your luck held today. That's enough for me." The flight crew wanted to make an overhead announcement. They wanted to introduce the man who had stepped out of the shadows to save them. But Mark slipped away through the galley door while the ground crew was distracted with the luggage. He refused the interviews with the local news crews already gathering at the fence. He refused the airline's offer of a $1,000,000 reward and a gold card. He didn't want the spotlight. He wanted the first taxi he could find to take him to the local regional airport so he could catch a charter flight home. He found a quiet corner near the taxi stand, the cold Newfoundland air biting through his thin shirt. His hands were still trembling, not from cold, but from the sudden absence of the specter. The warrior had done his job and was now retreating back into the shadows of the single dad. He called Emma as he walked toward a yellow cab, his voice finally breaking as he heard her, "Hello?" on the other end. "Hey, sweetie, it's Dad. I'm on the ground. There was a little delay, but I'm coming. I'll be there before the first act is over. I promise. I pinky swear." The crew watched him disappear into the fog from the terminal window. They had learned a lesson that day that no training manual could ever teach. True power isn't about the uniform you wear or the money in your bank account. It's about what you do when the world starts to fall apart and no one is looking. Not everyone who looks ordinary is ordinary. And some heroes, they don't want a parade. They just want to be home in time for dinner. Mark arrived at the school auditorium just as the lights were dimming for the start of the second act. He slipped into a seat in the very back row, trying to be invisible, still wearing his wrinkled jacket that now smelled of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid. He was a mess. His clothes were stained, his hair was a disaster, and he looked like he had been through a war, which in a way he had. On stage, Emma was absolutely shining. She was confident, her voice carrying to the back of the room with a clarity that made Mark's heart swell, with a pride so intense it was almost painful. During a brief pause in her monologue, her eyes scanned the audience, searching for one specific face. She found him in the back row. Her eyes widened, and she gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod and a bright, knowing smile that said, "I knew you'd make it." That smile was his Medal of Honor. That nod was his ticker tape parade. That night, for the first time in 10 agonizing years, Mark Reynolds slept through the entire night. No nightmares of fire, no sounds of radio static or falling jets. He knew he wouldn't be returning to the cockpit of a fighter jet or even a commercial one. He was perfectly happy with his feet on the solid ground, working his logistics job and making school lunches. But he wasn't running from his past anymore. He had faced his ghosts at 30,000 feet and left them there, somewhere over the Atlantic. He had realized that he wasn't a broken pilot. He was a father who used his broken pieces to build a shield for others. The narrator's voice closes the story as the camera pans over the empty, sun-drenched Seat 8A in the hangar where the plane is being inspected by engineers. He was just a passenger in Seat 8A, a man the world had forgotten and a man who was happy to be forgotten. But when the sky needed a warrior, a father woke up. He didn't do it for the fame, the money, or the thank you from the man in 9B. He did it because that's what fathers do. They keep the world turning for their children, even when the world is trying to fall out of the sky. The next time you see a tired stranger on a plane, someone with graying hair and a worn-out jacket, remember Mark Reynolds. Remember that heroes don't always wear uniforms or gold bars. Sometimes, they're just sleeping in the seat next to you, waiting for the moment they are needed most. Because a father's love is the ultimate flight control system. It never fails, it never glitches, and it always finds a way to bring everyone home. If you believe that true strength is found in the quietest people and that a father's love can conquer any fear, leave a comment with the word pilot and subscribe to Daddy Healing Stories. We share the stories of everyday heroes who remind us what it means to lead with integrity. Your support helps us keep the truth flying high.